this thing came in useful.
Okay, so our next speaker will be Dan Kaminski, giving us talk about the black ops of TCP/IP, including some interesting findings about Bitcoin, PNP, and TCP. So without any further ado, please give a warm round of applause for Dan Kaminski.
Give me 1 second here to bring these slides up. Windows P is the greatest thing ever. It just says, big projector works. 2011, this is finally not a headache. Holy crap, I'm in Brussels! Hi everyone, my name is Dan Kaminski. This is, I think, my third time here, not at BruCON, first BruCON, but third time in Brussels. And I'm really honored to be here. It's a last minute addition to the schedule, and everyone's been remarkably friendly, so thank you for that. So I'm Dan, I write code. I do a lot of stuff with DNSSEC and authentication, and while I would love to regale you about the story of DigiNotar and how DNSSEC will actually fix all this stuff, that is not the purpose of this talk. No, the purpose of this talk is to play with toys. I've been doing talks now for about a decade. And when I first started doing talks, it wasn't about DNS, it wasn't about authentication. It was about, wow, we've got this thing called TCP/IP, and it's pretty fun. And there's all these things that they say it can do. Let's find out what else it's capable of. But we don't really do much of that anymore. I mean, network security is kind of, fallen out of favor. It's the art of mapping networks and evading firewalls and subverting design assumptions. And, we don't really do that anymore because it's just not how most attacks work. In fact, let's be honest, every attack is just some individual finds a SQL injection in a website, gets that first little beachhead, takes the stored credentials on that one box, and hops from machine to machine to machine. And that's how pretty much the story goes every single time. NetSec is only so relevant in such an environment. Well, so what? I'm going to go mess with this anyway because it's a lot of fun. I'm sorry, I get to do that. Who knows? Maybe we'll find something interesting. So let's talk about one of the most interesting networks, interesting overlay, what's called an overlay network that's shown up in years. You guys familiar with this Bitcoin thing by any chance? Maybe shown up on your radar just a little. It's kind of funny. We joke Bitcoin is the thing that turns nerd forums into libertarian forums. It's like a mind virus. Let me tell you, I'm no more immune to it than anyone. So what is this thing? Attempt at a digital currency with no central bank, system with economic properties I don't know anything about. I'm not an economist. To be fair, neither are most economists. Bitcoin is an overlay network that, upon the internet, that people think has certain properties. Now, this actually interests me as an engineer. Bitcoin, in a nutshell, is based on 3 separate actions that are kind of tied together. The first is the transfer of wealth. Alice says, hi, I'm giving 2.1 Bitcoins to Bob. Instead of dollars, it's Bitcoins. There's no central magic bank. Alice just declares this. And so that gets into the second fact, which is everyone in the Bitcoin network needs to find this out. So there's gossip. Hey everyone, Alice has given 2.1 Bitcoins to Bob. Well, this gossip can float around, but how do you go from gossip to truth, to a ledger, a actual transaction that will be understood till the end of time that it has happened? So we have this third thing. Everyone, the official registry of transactions now includes Alice giving 2.1 Bitcoins to Bob. And this fact, this what's called appending to a blockchain, is gossip too. Now, there could be, anyone could go ahead and say that this has happened, this magic, this is the official record. So what's done is that this officialization of a transaction is mixed with a cryptographically hard problem. a problem so hard, it takes everyone in the world working as hard as possible 10 minutes to go ahead and do this job. You might say, well, how do you have a crypto problem that takes 10 minutes? Well, if it takes 1 minute, you make it harder and harder and harder until it takes 10 minutes. It's like a problem for math class. You just keep throwing numbers on there, you're just going to keep working longer and longer on it. It turns out in crypto, you can very easily increase the difficulty of a problem. And so it's kind of like gold mining, only the gold gets harder to find, literally, like it actively makes it so harder to find the harder you look for it. So it's like a post-gold, it's kind of cool. And then if you do this, if you are the one who hits the lottery, who completes the hard problem, you get 50 Bitcoins, which then goes back to the beginning and you can distribute that wealth elsewhere. So that's, the long and short of Bitcoin. And I need to have my phone out so I know what time I'm at. Now the truth of Bitcoin, first of all, this is not my Bitcoin talk. I don't want this to all be a talk on Bitcoin, but I needed to explain what was going on. Bitcoin's really impressive. Like, Bitcoin's in probably the top 5 most interesting things that have happened in security in the last 10 years. Entire classes of bugs are just missing from this thing. See, normally we see some software like, oh wow, that's pretty useful, but I'm going to scratch the surface and it's going to be crap. Bitcoin's like the exact opposite. Like, you look at it as a security guy, you're like, oh man, this thing's written in C, it's listening on the network, all these nodes in the world are listening, and if there's a hole, you get money. This is the worst case scenario for software, but the implementation is, it's spotless. It's crazy spotless. It's actually really funny. Ask me later, I'll explain how. Bitcoin has this situation where it's like, there are major game-ending bugs that are not there because lines of code are missing. Like, you can tell the bug was there, and then someone's like, gone. Yeah, it's actually really cool. So they fixed almost all the flaws that aren't forced by the design. The main flaws, though, are, it doesn't scale at all, and it is totally not autonomous. Scalability, you don't even need to tell you. You just go to Bitcoin's own scalability page, and they're like, yeah, eventually we're going to need to exchange like a gigabyte a second, and, well, you're going to have like 50 cores dedicated running 100% at all times just to keep up. And a 3 terabyte hard drive is only $200. You only need to buy one every 21 days. What's the problem? Yeah, it's not a system that scales. Eventually, you need to have these supernodes that handle all the work of being part of Bitcoin. And the supernodes look a heck of a lot like banks, because they're basically banks. Welcome to the new boss. It looks a heck of a lot like the old boss. So a lot of the properties of Bitcoin that people like, that nobody's in charge and all that, yeah, they go away. They go away because as soon as the thing gets popular, you need banks to keep up. But that's not why I'm talking to you about Bitcoin. One of my good friends, Travis Goodspeed, thought it would be interesting to say, hey Dan, do you think we can use Bitcoin, which is taking all of this data and distributing it throughout the entire world and has a whole bunch of money depending on this data never getting lost, do you think we could, like, hide stuff in there? And I'm like, well, there's no reason we couldn't. I don't know how many of you guys know this. Our community recently lost one of its shining lights, a guy, Len Sassman. If you take the core database now of Bitcoin and you run a strings bytes equals 20, what strings does is strings actually extracts human readable text from any file. If you run this on the Bitcoin database, if you look for human readable text, it's 450 megabytes from a month ago. I'm sure it's like 600 or 700 megs now. You will actually see an ASCII version of Len Sassman, which will be stored forever, along with our tribute to him. And just because Len would have found it hilarious, we also put in a version of Ben Bernanke. So how this works, Alice gives money to Bob by issuing a sort of challenge. Whoever can sign this message with the public key that hashes to the following bytes may claim this money. Well, bytes, bytes. Instead of pushing the hash of a public key, which is 20 bytes, we push some arbitrary text that string is able to find. And it's 20 characters of a testimony. That's why it was 20 characters wide. This does cost some Bitcoin. That was about 1 Bitcoin in total. It does, in fact, destroy the money. The network of Bitcoin is thoroughly convinced somehow, somewhere in the world, there is a public cryptographic key that has the hash of Len was our friend. I am totally okay with that. Cyber equivalent of pouring one out for your homie. Can we get higher bandwidth? Yeah. Bitcoin lets you send money to a public key directly rather than its hash. So you can get a 10x increase from 20 bytes to 200 bytes. Not mentioned here, not mentioned back at DEF CON. So some other people have actually started putting stuff in the Bitcoin chain. This is freaking classic. So if you're one of the people who's actually mining Bitcoins, like, winning that lottery every 10 minutes kind of thing, there's a thing called the Coinbase that you can put an arbitrary amount of money into, information into. And it's arbitrary. I mean, you can get up to like the 2 megabyte limit if you are the Coinbase calculator. So yeah, there's some Catholic guy who's been putting in a bunch of prayers. It's really weird. Like, it's weird. And like, you go to the forums and it just gets like creepy. The dude's apparently not a fan of religious freedom, and I don't know what the heck's going on. Yeah, I'm not messing with that. But I was curious, outside of the Coinbase, is there someone else, he's not a big fan of us either. It's easy. His way is legitimate. Our way, we're a bunch of idiots. But there's a third way to put data. There's another way to put data into a signature. See, Bitcoin works with small programs. There's no hard-coded way of saying, he who has the public key that hashes this value can claim the money. You can actually deliver small programs that describe what is required for someone to claim a distribution of wealth. And there are some limits, there's some hard limits right now to what programs you're allowed to deliver. But the basic one you're allowed to deliver is, here's a program that say, you're going to put this stuff, you put this stuff on a stack, and I will pull off the stack a public key, and I'll hash it, and I'll see what's going on. But what if there's extra material there? What if there's, not just like a public key there? What if there's, a big blob of extra stuff that you wanted to store in Bitcoin forever? Turns out that the program doesn't care. The program is only looking to see if the stuff that it wants is there. If there's extra content, well, it's unspecified. So you're allowed to put extra stuff on. So where this gets really interesting is it turns out that you as the person who sends money, you're not the only party that's able to add information. See, I know I'm sort of skipping over things. I apologize if this is a little confusing, but bear with me for a moment. You go ahead and you're trying to send money to your friends. You say, okay, I've got this money here. I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to push out this transaction that says, this money I have, I don't have it anymore. It is now claimable by whoever has this other key, this other information. Now, at some point in the future, that declaration will not just float around and be gossiped, but will actually be part of the official transaction record. But this takes time. This takes however long it takes. In that time in the middle, there's just a signature from you saying, okay, I've signed the fact that I handed over some money. That signature cannot cover, I'm explaining this terribly, I'm so sorry. The signature can't cover itself. Meaning, you can sign a message saying that I'm giving money to someone else, but your signature, there's a chicken and egg problem. The actual signature itself is unsigned. The place where you're putting extra data as an attacker is inside the signature itself. That's the actual location of it. So the problem is that the signature is protected from alteration only after it has been embedded into the Bitcoin blockchain. So in between the time that you push it out and then someone else puts it into the official Bitcoin blockchain, anyone in the world can go ahead and throw on extra data. That thing I told you about where you can put extra stuff on, it's not just you can put extra stuff on, other people can add stuff to your transactions. I wouldn't say it's a design flaw, but not pretty. But it is limited usefulness. You can only really abuse it if you're the guy computing blockchains. At that point, put stuff in the Coinbase. So long and short of it, it is actually possible to do not just embed data in Bitcoin, but a Bitcoin file system is actually technically possible. So what about anonymity? Can we go ahead and embed data into? Can we go ahead and figure out who is using Bitcoin? Well, if you go to this website called Block Explorer, you will see a bunch of sources of, so Bitcoin, every time you make a move in Bitcoin, you're always making up a new identity. Oh, I'm this ID, I'm that ID. And, it makes everyone think that Bitcoin is anonymous because you're constantly generating new IDs. Now, the thing is, because of the way internals of Bitcoin, all those identities on the left in the same transaction that are giving money to, so all the people on the left are giving money to all the people on the right. So the people on the left, that's ID plus some amount of money. That's all put into a pile, and then that pile is divvied up into the destinations. All those guys on the left are the same guy, just by the way that Bitcoin works, because all of them had to coordinate to participate and sign the same blob of data at the same time. They're the same ID. So you can actually go ahead and figure out a lot, most of the identities in Bitcoin are linkable. And Reed and Harrigan put out a paper. I was going to announce this. They put out the paper first. They win. They went ahead and made all these graphs that went ahead and linked. Okay, so now we can go ahead and figure out, here's some thief, and then here's all the other identities that he had. And then one of the identities was actually open and identifiable, so we busted the thief. Reed and Harrigan happened to get lucky, though. One of the sources of, it's actually a bit tricky to actually get your hands on Bitcoin. I'm not even kidding. If you actually want to go buy Bitcoin, you have to go get a Second Life account and get Second Life Linden dollars and install the Second Life client and go into Second Life, and then you actually got to go walk around and find an ATM in polygons. And mind you, there's music. This actually happened, right? I needed to go get some Bitcoin and jump into Second Life because I had to authenticate myself. And no joke, every area in Second Life has music playing. So I'm on a journey to Journey. It's super weird. Second Life still exists, and you can buy Second Life Linden dollars. You can convert Second with PayPal, and then you can use Second Life Linden dollars to buy Bitcoin. Oh yeah, that's what you think I did this for fun? No, I did it for science. I did it for lead, okay?
Right. You suffer for science.
Yes. The land of polygon dongs, I tell you. All right. So the deal is that linking pseudonyms isn't, a couple of the pseudonyms, Reed and Harrigan got lucky because the pseudonyms, the randomly generated IDs, they just had idiots running them. At one point, one of the guys got money from a source that published all the IP addresses that it gives money to. Another user posted to a forum seeking donation to a linked ID. So basically, outside of Bitcoin, someone has to take one of those pseudonyms and link it to an IP address, or a name, or whatever. The question is, this is, as Reed Harrigan say, much of the analysis they had was circumstantial. We cannot say for certain whether these flows imply a shared agency. There's always the possibility of drawing flawed inferences. The question is there another source of data? Well, there are two sources of transaction information in Bitcoin. There's those blocks that have been set in stone. Those actually store until the end of time all the transactions that have ever occurred and then distribute to all the nodes that are participating in Bitcoin. This is why Bitcoin does not scale. But there's a second class of information in Bitcoin. Remember, I keep telling you, Bitcoin's got to gossip around everyone. Hey, did you hear Alice gave money to Bob, Bob gave money to Charlie, etc. It's a big relay race. Alice tells Bob and Charlie, Bob tells David and Eric, Charlie tells Frank and Gary. If an attacker connects to every node in the public cloud, which is not that hard, it turns out, the first node to inform you of a transaction is the node that actually is the identity. That's what it turns out to be. You relayed it, because basically most people are relaying it, but if you're connected to everyone, the first person, the source of the transaction, tells you first. So it's like, you done relay, you done tell me because you done it. So I wrote a little piece of code called BruCON. It does accelerated probing of the Bitcoin network. It just connects to everybody. Discovering nodes isn't that hard. You just scan the internet on port 8333, join IRC channels. You can also ask just every node in Bitcoin about every other node in Bitcoin. They'll tell you. Mapping the cloud is pretty much instantaneous. And when you actually ask the Bitcoin people, like, oh yeah, we are totally not anonymous. Tor does indeed obfuscate IPs that derive from outbound connections. But it does nothing if you're still listening. So Tor does not protect you from inbound connections. So someone who goes ahead and sweeps the internet and finds your listener, even though your outbound connections are over Tor, your inbound stuff is still linked to your IP. What about unreachable nodes? Well, most are behind NAT and only connect via outbound links. Meaning, if you become most of the network that provides for inbound connectivity, then generally all the hidden nodes, all the nodes that you can't connect out to, they will end up connecting to you. Because there's only 3,000, 8,000 nodes on the internet that are listening for a Bitcoin at any moment. You probably only need a few hundred since each Bitcoin node connects to 7. And you only need 1. Here's the thing. How unreachable is a node that is behind NAT? See, most home routers nowadays implement NAT. It's a way of taking one public IP address and separating it out, allowing multiple other, every laptop in the room can be behind the same IP address. That wasn't how it was supposed to work, but it actually does. Now, you might be playing video games, World of Warcraft, or whatever, and you might actually want the rest of the internet to be able to make connections back to you so that your video game works. Otherwise, you have to proxy off some central server, and that isn't necessarily as efficient. So most home routers implement something called UPnP, Universal Plug and Play. It's a way of telling your home router, dear router, please allow the internet to connect back into me. Here's what's kind of funny. UPnP allows nodes inside your network to ask the router to open ports up from the internet. The way that this works is that internal hosts send out a message saying, hi, I'm looking for all the routers, and then the router replies and says, yeah, I'm here. And then what's supposed to happen is the yeah, I'm here is supposed to include an address that only hosts on the internal network can find out, that is randomized, and only hosts on the internal network can connect to. It'd be really bad if hosts on the outside could connect to this internal facing thing. Yes, you want your internal host to be able to say, dear internet, let me in. You don't want the internet to be able to say, dear internet, let me in. Yeah. Turns out that there's hundreds of thousands to millions of hosts on the internet today that are running NAT that would otherwise be blocking inbound connectivity from the internet. But it turns out the internet can just ask nicely using the internal protocol on the external interface. And you just say, oh hey, it's a nice router you got there. Could you open up some firewall holes? Because I really need to scan your internal boxes. So there was a speaker at DEF CON who was talking about this, Daniel Garcia. He actually has an entire UPnP mapper. We're actually starting a little UPnP research group. to figure out what we already have the verbs that you issue to open up ports. We want to see how widespread the problem is. There are entire countries that have standardized on devices that would otherwise be providing firewalls that don't anymore. Now the thing is that most desktops at this point are running host firewalls by default. So it's not as apocalyptic as it would have been, say, in 2001. It's not good, let me tell you, because there's a lot of crappy devices on your home networks that haven't been exposed and haven't been attacked because there's been no route to them. Never underestimate the security value of a brick wall, but it turns out brick walls don't work too well against bulldozers. What about outside the consumer space? We don't really have UPnP on corporate networks. We also, turns out, don't really have that much of firewalls, way less than we think. A lot of devices on corporate networks are actually protected from the internet with nothing but access control lists. Dirty little secret, but it's like there's no firewall. It's just, well, here's the IP ranges we accept traffic from, and we just sort of assume, no one can connect to us unless they're us with our IP addresses. Well, the old trick is IP spoofing. You just pretend to be a source IP near a target. We'll probably pass the ACLs. People say, but spoofing isn't supposed to work. We've got best practices. Best practices means it still works. Real-world IP spoofing is not hard as long as you're not like a cloud node. It turns out the one thing the cloud is really good at is stopping you from spoofing your source IP. Is IP spoofing still effective? Yeah. Actually, there's a really old trick that you do. What you do is you get a node that can go ahead and spoof any IP address, and then you pretend to be a DNS client, and you ask the entire internet for some randomized name. And the key is, but it's inside a domain you control. And the key is you ask as a neighbor of whoever you're asking. So if you're asking 1.2.3.4, you're spoofing traffic from 1.2.5.0, something from the same class B network, the /16, a nearby neighbor. Your goal is to appear to be someone who's nearby, but far enough away that they might be coming from the internet. And now your request gets through the router's access control list, and it hits some name server that is on that protected network. Now, the name server just got a request from a neighbor. It's going to send its reply back to the neighbor, but wait, this is DNS. There was a lookup for something at attackerdomain.com. It's got to go ahead and send a request over to attackerdomain.com to find out what the actual value it ultimately needs to send is. And so you find out that you have compromised the access control list through the forwarded DNS lookup. It works very, very, very nicely. Now, granted, this only works for this obscure application called DNS, or UDP. Certainly nothing built on TCP, right? Well, I'm a little constrained on time, so I'm going to have to blast through this section. But most protocols run over TCP at this point. And TCP prevents you from being able to spoof traffic by kind of having passwords in both directions. Alice has a sequence number to Bob, Bob has a sequence number to Alice. Alice, in order to complete the connection, has to be able to reflect both of those values. Basically prove to Bob that she can hear Bob. It's like, Bob says, I'm not going to talk to you until you can prove that you actually hear what I have to say. It is actually an effective way of reducing the set of attackers that can communicate with you. Now, sequence numbers didn't used to be random. You used to just sort of be able to guess them. There's, great stories involving Kevin making predictable sequence numbers. It turns out sequence numbers are not entirely random, though. They're random unless it could be interpreted as a connection from the same session. Meaning, it's another connection, but it's the same source port, des port, source IP, des IP. And effectively, in that situation, what was once randomly selected to have a random password is like, wait, this might get confused. We're going to make this sequential according to time. And it's done with a cryptographic function. Just so you see what's happening here, the first and the third sequence number are sequential in time because all the values are the same. In the second one, in that middle, we changed one byte to connection to 2.3.4.6 instead of 2.3.4.5, and the sequence number is now wildly different because you want a random password whenever you can get one. So here's the problem. If someone floods you with connection requests, you have to remember all their passwords, all these sequence numbers, right? So that takes memory, and there's only a finite of memory that you have available. The attacker doesn't have a limit for memory, he just keeps sending you crap and forgetting about it. But you gotta go ahead and remember. So it's called SynFlood. It's old as dirt. So the solution that came up was called SynCookies. It's specified back in 1999. And what it is, it says, the password you get is not, I'm not gonna remember the password I tell you. You're gonna repeat it back to me. The password I'm going to tell you is an encrypted challenge. You know, server says to the client, you show me that you remember. You show me that you can talk to me. And then I'll invest the resources in, then I will invest the resources in proving that I can communicate with you, or in communicating with you. Now, the thing is, because I didn't mention this earlier, sequence numbers were not originally designed to be passwords. Designed to be connection authenticators. So they're small, they're only 32 bits. Worse, only 24 of those bits are actually used as an authenticator in a SYN cookie. So when you actually do the math, this means an attacker who sends you 8 million packets can go ahead and with a spoofed source IP, not only get past your access control list, because all 8 million packets will get past the attacker as the spoofed source, but it'll actually be accepted by the destination TCP stack. So you can go ahead and actually have a HTTP payload in those 8 million packets. And if you have an HTTP endpoint that says, if I get a request from a peer IP, I'm going to do whatever it says, because that's a trusted IP address. The bad guy can get their stuff through just by triggering your sequence number protection. This is known. Dan Bernstein says it. No matter what function is used, the attacker will succeed in a connection forgery after millions of random ACK packets. But he said this in 1999. 8 million packets are a lot easier to send in 2011 than 1999. So bottom line, forged connections can have arbitrary sources. They can get through your ACKs, and they can contain arbitrary web services payloads. So long and short, don't be authenticating your web services endpoints with nothing but an IP address and a prayer. Are you safe if you disable SYN cookies? Well, here's what's funny. Linux, we have this standard for generating sequence numbers. And like I said, it's random, except if those 4 source port, source IP, dest IP values are the same. Linux is totally compliant with this for the lower 24 bits. The upper 8 bits, however, have been sequential. Sequential, incrementing by 1 every 5 minutes. This is how it has pretty much always been. When Linux and I were talking about it, he's like, wow, this actually predates my check-in history in the source tree. So this is, it came from the 90s stuff. So what this basically means is that even without SYN cookies, someone can go ahead and, after 8 million packets, inject an HTTP request from an arbitrary source IP. There are some interesting implications for reset attacks, which I'll have to skip over, but the long and short of it is that the old attacks from 2005, where you can shut down a TCP session, are made much, much easier when each side of the connection only has 24 bits in the sequence number instead of 32. There's also some possibilities with being able to inject into active TCP sessions. It's a royal pain in the ass. It's possibly the single weakest thing that I found in terms of, realistically being able to do. But you basically, this is all nice. Here's the problem. You had 64 bits of security, and it looked great, right? Except you weren't just using it for security. We lost 16 bits in each direction because we needed to be able to have what are called window sizes. We needed to have multiple, I don't just want to get data that's right on the nose, maybe I want to have like data in flight because I'm going over a satellite link. And then I need more than just 65,000 bytes in flight, I need like hundreds of kilobytes and maybe even megabytes in flight. So you have the 64-bit resource, which became a 32-bit resource, which became a 16-bit resource, became an 8-bit, and all of a sudden the security value went away because it's just brute force. So I was joking with Alec earlier, brute force, it's a hammer, and it's a really, sometimes all you got is that one hammer, but it's a really useful hammer. There are some pain in the butts with ports. Linux does go ahead and randomize ports on a per session basis. Bug me later if you want to know how this impacts the attack. Status, this is actually old. They're fixing this thing. The CVE is out, the news is out, the patches are going in. They're just making the sequence numbers fully 32-bit. They're getting rid of that upper 8-bit stuff. They also had MD4. They are not moving into SHA-1. They're moving into MD5 as the function. And for this particular use, that's fine. Here's a digression. IRC 1948 is an interesting construction. Can someone bring me water, by the way, because I'm getting a little parched here. IRC 1948 is an interesting construction. It basically says that sequence numbers, if you know the secret that is used to shuffle them, they're sequential and ordered. Otherwise, they're random and unpredictable. So, what this means is you kind of have like a private component, the secret mixed with the for tuple, that allows you to generate all possible sequence numbers, all the possible passwords. But there's also a public component, a particular sample sequence number that is transmitted over the network. And if you can receive it, you know that particular password. So the private situation is you know every password. The public situation is you know this particular password. So is that public-private cryptography with nothing but a password? I mean, that is impossible. And this is hopefully delicious. Gentlemen prefer blondes. Anyway. Alright, well, clearly we can't do public-private cryptography with nothing but a password. It's only possible because I'm playing games with definitions and, there's the intersection of network security and cryptography. Alright. What I'm about to tell you is a really bad idea. But that's okay because nowhere does it say when you present at conferences you can only present good ideas. Passwords suck. They're constantly being lost and forgotten and stolen. They're responsible for 50% of compromises, and they increasingly look like leak speak as if, because the bad guys haven't figured out that I looks like 1 and S looks like $sign. I'm not talking about 0. Dear God, it's like the Hollywood operating system, only we're actually requiring it. It's a best practice. Leak speak as best practice. That's right. Oh, yes. But that's not water.
It's lovely.
Oh, no, that is water. That's actually the water I prefer. For a second, I thought that was vodka. That'd be a terrible idea. Alright, listen. Assuming we ignore the fact that passwords are awful and terrible, assuming we're stuck with them, we got an old challenge in network security. How do we use a password to log into a system without that system learning our password? Now, the most common answer, the thing we get all angry at companies when they don't do it, is we hash it. We hash the password. Guys, users are still giving the web server the plain text password. An attacker that's hacked your web server can totally hack your web app to log the plain text password after it's inserted. Yeah, you're not pulling it out of the database en masse, but you go ahead and you extract 24 hours of logins into a major web application. You're going to get a pretty substantial subset of the user base. Another strategy is to try to use one of these challenge response protocols, something like NTLM or Digest. So don't send me the password, send me the password hashed against this particular random value. Well, guess what? The server still has to store a plain text password or some password equivalent value. So there's still stuff to go ahead and crack offline. Third approach is to try to mix the password with the actual mechanics of a otherwise anonymous Diffie-Hellman key exchange. This is what Speak does and SRP does. It's not standardized in any of the browsers, and that's kind of the problem. You basically end up having to send the user code in JavaScript to do this big, complicated crypto exchange. And you know what the bad guy does? He just has you not do that exchange. Or he adds a little JavaScript to the page that sniffs the password in plain text out of the browser and sends it out of band. So it seems like a nice idea. Oh, and you still end up with plain text equivalent stuff living on the server. So what do we do? So, is it possible, not advisable, it's obviously a bad idea, but is it possible to build a system where the client only remembers the password, but the server stores nothing but a public key, and deploys nothing but a standard already included in the browser challenge to the client to make sure that it has the matching private key, which is derived unilaterally from that password? In other words, can we construct a cryptographic key pair out of a password? Well, here's an interesting question. What was the one vulnerability that impacted all asymmetric crypto systems, be it RSA, DSA, or ECC? Anyone? One bug killed all of them. It was really embarrassing. Named after two people. What was that? Anyway, well, I don't remember the Debian bug, where, yeah, remember that random number generator that really should be solid before you go ahead and generate a cryptographic key with it? How about we don't have that? We have no entropy in there. Basically, the problem was that OpenSSL on Debian, when it generated random numbers, it always generated the same random numbers. Well, all asymmetric crypto systems use entropy as follows. They grab some random bits and then permute those bits. They alter them until they meet certain requirements. And then once permuted, that's your public-private key pair. So if you're always emitting the same random bits, you're always generating the same key pair. Predictable entropy means predictable key pairs, no matter what the algorithm is. So what we're going to do is we're going to turn the Debian bug into a feature. See, cryptography is all about constructions. You have hash functions and string ciphers and block ciphers, all of which can be constructed from one another. We do know how to take a password and construct an everlasting stream of pseudo-random number generator, pseudo-random numbers from it. That's predictable entropy. We even know how to make this transformation both time-hard, meaning it requires a whole bunch of CPU to do the conversion from password to stream. Also, memory hard, meaning it takes some huge amount of memory, kind of memory that a GPU does not have in infinite amounts. So the idea is, what if you make the output of a password-seeded PRNG the input to an asymmetric key generator? You would basically end up with 2048-bit RSA keys with a trapdoor in the form of a password. Now this is not theoretical. I actually have this. Here's SSH keygen generating a couple of keys, and you'll notice that each time they are different. Now we're going to load a little thing called Fidelius that actually hijacks dev-random and dev-urandom and causes them to implement whenever, basically, given a passphrase, in this case, hi grandma, it will actually generate the same random numbers every time. And if you have that, these two instances of SSH keygen, they suddenly go ahead and always emit the same key. So why is it called Fidelius? It's called Fidelius because Harry Potter, properly understood, is a story about the epic consequences of losing one's password. Fidelius is serious. This is the spell that fails. It's like the point of the entire story. least from an infosec perspective. So Fidelity's hooks dev random, urandom, a bunch of open SSL stuff, and a few other tidbits to provide predictable entropy where it isn't expected. It uses the modified version of the scrypt algorithm to require about 1 second of processing time, 256 megs of RAM. Basically, it gives you about 20 extra bits of security. It's hard to get past 20, but 20 is better than 0. This does a decent job of making it impossible to, a GPU that would otherwise be trying 700 million passwords a second can now try 32 passwords a second, so I think it's a win. Fidelis gives you generic multi-application support for predictably generating key pairs for passwords. So SSH keygen for SSH keys, OpenSSL for certs, Freebird for DNS keys. They all get a backdoor. So it's not exactly a consensual backdoor. It's impossible to recognize a certificate that does or does not have the passphrase behind it. So you can basically sign a message with a password, encrypt the message to a password asymmetrically. With Bitcoin, you could literally give money to a photograph. It's kind of neat. And there's no paid server side. Now, the issues with Fidelity is obviously it's using passwords, so it's crap. The non-obvious ones, it's fragile. You're not just using SSH keygen, you're using SSH keygen 5.3 P1 on this particular platform. You're sort of taking all the implicit, unspecified aspects of how entropy is used by an application to generate a key, and you're saying, no, now these must never change. So there are definite downsides to this approach. It's also hard to salt. We'll talk about that another time. But I do want to talk about one last thing that is really a network thing and is from this line of research, kind of what people have been talking about the most. And it's all about biased networks. Who here is aware about the debates of network neutrality? All right, so here's the deal. There's an end game here, and the end game is we're going to be able to bust all of this stuff. Like the questions of whether or not a network is biased. See, I'm not worried about things where it's just like you can't access something. Because that's, no one's hiding, right? It's like, screw you just don't get that port. Okay, that's a policy discussion to have. But what I'm worried about is when networks are just slightly degraded. You don't really know, it's deniable. How can you tell whether something is there or not? What I'm here to tell you is we're going to be able to find biased network policy, no matter how subtle it is. So if biased networks are affecting you, this gives you proof. And if you are biasing your networks, then this is how proof is going to come. So let's look at the basic topology that exists out there in general. You have some clients, there's a router in front of the client, and it talks to the ISP. The ISP has a bunch of internet connections, and those internet connections go to Google or Yahoo or Microsoft. And here's the theory. First, some magic box is deployed within the ISP network in front of all of those links. Second, the box matches packets to policies and applies different rules to different packets. Now, these rules can be stateless. Do I like this particular packet? Or they can be stateful. This packet is part of a flow. It's a streaming video going from YouTube. I don't like streaming videos from YouTube, so I'm going to slow that down. The policies can be anything. It can do anything. Limit maximum bandwidth, increase minimum latency. It can even alter the content. So the problem is that these policies can be very subtle in their effect. Say Bing.com is 50 milliseconds slower than Google.com. Is this because of the ISP? Or is this because Google.com is better hosting, or the transcontinental links are a little weird today, but only for Google and not for Bing because of where they are on the network? There's many reasons why Bing.com might be slower than Google.com, which means the ISP has plausible deniability. So what we need to do is be able to eliminate that deniability. We need to normalize the network. Whether a given tester is accessing Bing.com or Google.com, the network path, including the server hosting the data, should be identical, or at least uncorrelated with the identity in question. That way, any changes won't be the server, won't be the network path. If there's differential policy around, it's got to be coming from the ISP. So, really simple normalization. Let's say there's a policy. All flows associated with an HTTP request with the host www.bing.com should be delayed by 50 milliseconds. Great. Configure a single web server to accept HTTP requests for Bing and Google, and man, that's not even a work. That's Squid. That's a proxy server. So you set your client to use something as a proxy server, and if traffic when the proxy server is proxying Bing gets worse performance than when it's proxying Google, it's the same server, it's the same network path, and it's got to be the ISP. This is actually going to bust someone, and it's the simplest thing you could do today. The problem is it's really protocol dependent. HTTP is basically designed to be allowed for this, but other protocols require a lot of work to implement and especially emulate. The bigger issue is the policy can be specific to an IP address. You know, you can put a few hundred testers all over the world, and I know people that have. And if you're an ISP, you can just be like, yeah, we just don't apply policy to those things. That, you know, your measurement suite is not Google. Your measurement suite is not Bing. And so it doesn't matter how many servers you have if the policies are IP specific. So I've been working on a code base which really should be out right now, but I've frankly been traveling too much. It's called Neuter. It is the network normalization engine. It is a neutrality router. And to explain how Neuter works, how many of you guys have ever used a VPN? All right. Check it out. In a VPN, traffic is pushed from your client to some connection broker. We usually call this a VPN concentrator. That VPN concentrator has a batch of IP addresses, and it goes ahead, it goes and talks to Bing and talks to Google, talks wherever the heck you're going. And responses go back to that broker. And the responses are encrypted and sent back to you. So it's like your network connection has been moved over to wherever the connection broker is. You guys with me so far? And when you're using a VPN, all of these ISP policies are basically worthless. I mean, they can filter VPN traffic, but they don't know whether you're connecting to Bing or Google or whatnot. Well, that's a problem. If they don't know, the policies aren't being applied, so we can't tell if the policies are there. Now, we're getting around whatever policies are there, but that's not enough. We gotta know that they're there. What if instead of encrypting the traffic back, instead of encrypting the server-to-client traffic from broker to client, what if we just pass it in the clear? We have it unencrypted. In fact, why don't we spoof the IP addresses from Google? Why don't we pretend it to be Bing? Well, if you do that, why would you do that? Because you want the ISP to see the return traffic. You want the ISP to say, oh wow, look at all those packets from Bing. I gotta slow that crap down. That's what you're looking for. We're trying to trigger the response that would normally be reserved for Bing or Google and get it to apply to our test server. The policy engine can't tell because we're impersonating the source IPs. But the traffic took the same path and it came from the same source. Why is my test server slower when it's pretending to be one IP address than another? That's the game we're trying to get. Now, I may have actually just busted it. Who thinks this doesn't work? Out of curiosity, because you're like a network engineer or something. Anyone? Aww. I just love when there's network engineers in the talks, and I was like, no, that can't work. There's a bug, or at least there appears to be a bug. The policy engine in this scenario is only seeing return traffic from the server to the client. It's not seeing any of the normal client-to-server traffic that would be starting up a flow. Because that normal, in a VPN, you encrypt all your traffic to the broker, and it encrypts all the traffic back. All we're doing is not encrypting the traffic back. We're still encrypting the traffic to the broker. So, what if the policy engine says, we know there's these newer things out there, so we're going to be sneaky. We're only going to apply policy when we see the entire connection, not when we see these weird half situations. You do that. It's a trap. Check it out. we got this thing called roto-neuter. In normal neuter, you spoof the server to the client. In roto-neuter, you do it the other way around. You spoof the client to the server. Say I have two different sessions that I'm doing a test with. In sample A, the client talks directly to the real Google. It's totally legitimate. Client talks to Google, Google talks to the client. Everything is as it should be. And you get a particular set of performance. Sample B, the client talks to the real Google by way of the broker. Spoofs the client. And Google replies directly. In other words, the client's sitting there and goes, I'm going to go ahead, I'm going to intentionally make sure that the ISP only sees half the session. So, tunnels the information over to the broker. The broker's like, I don't exist. I'm going to pretend the client really directly spoke to Google. And it goes ahead and spoofs the client to Google. Google replies to the client. Client's happy, it sent a package to Google. Google replied to the client. But the ISP only saw a half flow this time. Shouldn't be a performance implication, but I think we had a rule that said the policy doesn't apply if there's only a half flow. So in this weird-ass half-flow situation, if things get faster, you have found the policy engine. Both samples have the same path. If you get differential policy, that means the ISP's been playing games. So it's a catch-22. The ISP applies policy to half flows. Neuter differentiates the performance of a spoofed half flow of Google versus a spoofed half flow of Bing. If the ISP applies policies to full flows, roto-neuter differentiates the performance of a full flow to the real Google versus a half flow to the real Google. Either way, I win. So this is the end game. You know, if you've got a bias policy, it might as well be transparent, because it's sure as heck getting busted. Now, here's the last section. I might go over by 2 minutes, but no more than 2 minutes. My favorite trick of the talk is here. I gotta let you do it. Check it out. Retaining full flows. Let's say you really want the ISP to see the full bidirectional traffic. The advantage, why would you want this? Well, it's going to trigger all the possible policies, and if you've got some mandatory NATs in there, you've got to have full flows because the NAT needs to know there's client-to-server traffic in order to allow the server to reply. Disadvantage, if the ISP sees client-to-server traffic, then the server's seeing the ISP to server traffic. Your SYN gets out, it goes leaves your host, hits your router, triggers the NAT, goes to the ISP, keeps going, hits the server, and the server's like, what the heck is this? Because remember, the server was actually supposed to be, there's supposed to be a session from the broker that is being mapped in. It's not actually supposed to be the real server. So the real server may reply, interfere, complain, and so on. So we've got 3 strategies. The first strategy is, I can't believe it's 2011 and this is useful. You can actually apply a bad TCP checksum. So you've got this stream that's going off over to the broker and it's communicating with Bing, Yahoo, whatever. The thing that you are really sending, you're really sending through your ISP. You send SYNs and ACKs and all that kind of good stuff, but you flip a few bits that make it all look like it's corrupt. And so it gets all the way to the destination, and then the destination drops it on the floor. This works great unless any of the middle boxes actually bother to check the TCP checksum. Now it turns out there's a catch-22 here as well. If the policy is disabled when checksums are bad, you can basically prove the existence of a policy engine by having the broker provide good sums while you provide bad sums. It actually works kind of nicely. Low TTL. You can control how many hops your outbound packets go. So you have a stream of packets that are they're going to get past the NAT, they're going to get past the ISP, they're going to get past the policy engine, they're going to die in the middle of the internet. That way they'll never get to the server. You can do that too. The ISP can go ahead and say, well, we won't apply our policy engine unless the TTL is high enough. In which case it's another catch-22. But this time I can tell you at which hop the policy engine is at. So I win again. But this is the one that is the thing that I gotta tell you. Okay, I think maybe 5% of the room is gonna get this. But it's so fun, I've gotta try. When a TCP stack receives a message that is not associated with an active socket, it's supposed to send a reset. It's supposed to say, you are sending me crap and I don't know what this crap is, so goodbye, go away, reset. But you see, we've got these things called firewalls that say anything that isn't perfect should just be dropped on the floor. Okay, that's great, because all we're trying to do is get a server to drop traffic on the floor, right? So what we do is we have the client do an actual three-way handshake with the real Google. So client sends Google, Google replies to the client, the session is set up. ISP sees the session, NAT sees the session, everything is good. But now, the broker goes ahead, the broker is in cahoots with the client, the broker knows all the sequence numbers and all the good crap, broker sends a reset over to Google, shuts that crap down. Client has an open connection, NAT has an open connection, ISP has an open connection, Google is shut down. Broker goes ahead, it creates a session with Google. It's got a nice session, it's going back and forth, and you know what the broker does? Broker NATs its connection into the thing that is already open. So it knows what the client's expecting, it knows what the ISP is expecting, goes ahead and links its connection over to the original session. And here's where it gets awesome. Client's now sending traffic back and forth, client's sending all this traffic to Google. Google, that connection was reset, Google ignores the crap out of it. Because that's not part of a valid session, and by firewall rules, if it's not part of a valid session, you must ignore it. So you basically, you get to splice two connections together. It's a NAT that wraps around the internet. It is a really fun stunt. As a final note, if you happen to be somebody who is passively monitoring network traffic, do be aware these techniques mean it is totally possible for a malicious client and server pair, or actually just a malicious client, to make it look like they're having a conversation with anyone they want you to think they're having, particularly if a server ignores unassociated traffic. So please keep your logs, validate checksums, check your TTLs, etc. So Neuter will be out soon. Bug me if you're interested. Networks are neat. I hope you enjoy. I suppose I'm open for questions, but actually I don't know, am I?
Well, maybe the people that aren't that hungry can stay and pose a question to Dan. So anybody has a question for Dan?